So good evening. My name is Oren McCarthy. I am UNICRI's liaison officer here in New York, and I have the great pleasure to get us started with today's side event on the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism in the Americas. I have the great pleasure to introduce our co-hosts and co-organizers. So first of all, Mr. René Alfonso Rudiaz Perez, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Chile. And then we will be followed up with Ms. Alison Treble, Executive Secretary of CTED at the Organization of American States, who will be followed by Mr. Leif Willitsen, the Deputy Director of UNICRI, the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute. And then we will shortly be joined by Assistant Secretary General Ms. Natalia Germain, Executive Director of CTED. So without further ado, in the interest of time, I will hand over to Mr. René Alfonso Rudiaz Perez, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Chile, to get us underway. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone attending this event. For Chile, we are very pleased and honored to have been invited to co-sponsor this important side event. And we would like to thank, the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, the Organization of American States, and the Executive Director of Counter-Terrorism Committee of the United Nations for this timely initiative, that explore the linkages between terrorism and organized crime in the Americas. One of the most important characteristics of the rapid evolution of terrorism in recent years has been precisely its progressive linkage of activities related to transnational organized crime. This is especially true for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, where the effects of transborder criminal activity represent today a major threat to democracy, governance, and the human security of our populations. We have seen how, in South America in particular, drug trafficking cartels have resorted to terrorist tactics and extreme violence to protect their economic interest and hit back at the law enforcement agencies that combat them. Conversely, key terrorist groups operating in the continent carry out a series of criminal acts like trafficking of human, drugs, arms, and precious metals to finance the promotion, recruitment, and training of persons for terrorist purposes. In this phenomenon, factors such as corruption, lack of resources of security agencies, and the porous borders facilitate the commission of these crimes and serve as essential sources for money laundering and terrorist financing. These activities mutually reinforce each other and are especially prevalent in the vulnerable areas where the presence of a state is weak. Terrorists and criminal groups often coincide in certain spaces or willingly utilize the same routes and contacts to carry out their operational needs. Moreover, their collaboration in the online arena is an issue that warrants out urgent action and attention. For all these reasons, interstate cooperation in cross-border areas and the exchange of information between fundamental intelligence and law enforcement agencies turns to be fundamental. Likewise, the role of international and regional organizations in promoting the discussion and cooperation in this regard is a key aspect of a state's efforts to comprehend and address this very toxic relationship. Chile is very appreciative of the efforts of the OAS through the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, CTED, as well as the United Nations through UNICRI and UNOTC, among other agencies, to support our region in this sense. We value, in fact, the fact that the 7th review of United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, as well as the draft resolution of the 8th review, which we expect to be adopted by consensus, recognize the nexus between terrorism and transnational organized crime, and more significantly, encourages member states to enhance knowledge and support initiatives to address it. Chile is dedicated to the implementation of UN Security Council Resolutions 2195, 2331, 2370, that address this issue, as well as the Financial Action Task Force 40 recommendations to fight money laundering and terrorist financing at the national and global levels. In conclusion, we look forward to hearing this discussion today about the OAS-UNICRI findings on their study on the linkages between organized crime and terrorism in the Americas as a way to continue promoting and discussing this issue of utmost importance to the regional and the international peace and security. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you very much for these opening words. I now pass the floor to Ms. Alison Treppel, Executive Secretary of CTED, Organization of American States. Alison, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Oren, and good afternoon. I guess it's evening now already. Many thanks to all of you for joining us here for this conversation today. For those of you who may not be familiar with CTED, the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism of the Organization of American States, we are the Western Hemisphere's principal multilateral forum for preventing and countering terrorism in the Americas. We are extremely pleased to be able to host this event today with the UN's Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, the UN's Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, UNICRI, and the government of Chile to bring attention to an area that is of growing concern in our region. That area, of course, as the title of this side event suggests, is the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism in the Americas. At this point, it's been pretty well established that transnational organized crime has deep roots in the Americas. Drug trafficking, firearms trafficking, human trafficking, and migrant smuggling are criminal activities that impact every country of our hemisphere to varying degrees. On top of that, and according to UNODC figures, more than 2.5 million homicides have been committed in Latin America since the year 2000. This means that although our region only accounts for 8% of the global population, it is home, unfortunately, to more than a third of the world's homicides. At the same time, our region has suffered much at the hands of terrorists, particularly since the 1990s. Attacks in Buenos Aires, the presence of the FARC in Colombia, the Shining Path in Peru, and the events of September 11th in the United States, just to name a few examples, have left a profound mark on our communities.
Please excuse me.
No, welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Master.
Welcome, Natalia.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
Thank you.
not a problem.
Thank you, Alison.
The work, as we've heard quite a bit over the past few days, the work of both criminal and terrorist groups has evolved over the past 20 plus years. We are seeing that their ideologies, methodologies, and geographies are becoming ever more intertwined. In order for us to strengthen our region's capacity to better address and respond to these growing linkages, we need to better understand exactly how and why this nexus exists. And so, in line with many Security Council resolutions, and particularly Resolution 2482 of 2019, we're pleased to share with you all today some initial findings of a research effort we're undertaking together with UNICRI that will be published in the near future. As you will soon hear from Christian Viana de Acevedo, this study analyzes specific case studies that demonstrate not only how criminal and terrorist groups coexist, but how they are becoming increasingly enmeshed in our region. Perhaps more importantly, the study will offer some specific recommendations on how governments in particular can strengthen, if and when necessary, their criminal justice, law enforcement, and border control capacities in order to be able to respond effectively to these threats. The findings of our report will be further illustrated today by the inputs of 3 different experts: Juan Cruz Ponce, Deputy Executive Secretary of GAFILAT, Esther Zubiri of the UN Security Council Sanctions Monitoring Team, and Rafael Marquez, New York Police Department Intelligence Bureau Team Lead, Intelligence Analysis Unit. Many thanks to all 4 panelists for joining us here today. And again, thanks to all of you who are here in Conference Room 9 and connected online for your interest in this topic. I hope you find this to be a useful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Treppel. And allow me also to officially welcome ASG Chairman to the event. We're delighted to have you with you. Without further ado, I will pass the floor over to you for your introduction.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. And straightforwardly, I would like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Perez, Deputy Permanent Representative of Chile to the United Nations, Ms. Antonia Di Meo, Director of UNICRI, and of course, dear colleague and friend, Ms. Alison Treppel, Executive Secretary of CTED, all esteemed delegates and special guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of CTED, let me also welcome all of you to this event, organized with 2 of CTED's most important and long-standing partners, UNICRI and the Secretariat of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism of the Organization of American States, and of course co-sponsored by the government of Chile. The links between terrorism and transnational organized crime are a growing concern to all of us, and have long been high on the agenda of the Security Council and the General Assembly. The Council has recognized and expressed concern about the connection between transnational organized crime and terrorism in several resolutions. Key measures include strengthening legal and operational frameworks, broader matters of good governance, and the fight against corruption and financial crimes. The Council has emphasized the need to coordinate efforts at the local, national, sub-regional, and international levels to respond to this challenge. The Council has also encouraged Member States and the United Nations to continue enhancing their understanding of the nature and scope of the links that may exist between terrorism financing and transnational organized crime. And this brings us today, and the objectives of today's events are referring exactly to that important issue. And under the guidance of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, CTED has worked to increase its understanding of the terrorism transnational organized crime nexus and to identify possible responses. The most important way, it does this through its dialogue with the member states, including its assessment visits on behalf of the committee. CTED's first step is also to understand how the member states view the nexus. Through that dialogue, it identifies and investigates links between terrorist and criminals groups and listens to the lessons learned by member states. And CTED also supports the committee in dedicated open briefings and by engaging with regional partners. In addition to its 2019 study on human trafficking and terrorist financing, CTED's most recent Trends Alert highlighted examples of terrorist financing through proceeds derived from the illicit exploitation and trade in natural resources, including oil and natural gas, agriculture, forestry and fishing, wildlife, minerals and precious metals, and charcoal. And furthermore, discussions about the illicit trade in cultural property for terrorist purposes, organized by CTED in close collaboration with UNESCO and the Permanent Mission of Italy to the United Nations in September 22, and also as a side event tomorrow, highlight the scale and intensity of the phenomenon, as well as the use of emerging technologies and social media platforms to advance the illicit trade in cultural property and to generate proceeds from related activities. Dear colleagues, CTED had also worked with the FATF on money laundering and terrorist financing risks arising from migrant smuggling, illicit arms trafficking, and the illicit trade in art, antiquities, and other cultural objects. CTED also works closely with FATF-style regional bodies in the same way. And in fact, we are very pleased to be joined by our close partner, Gafilat, today. Throughout this work, CTED has identified key vulnerabilities of member states. They are common regardless of the exact nature of the nexus. Most noticeably, they include the failure to assess the relevant risks and the lack of financial investigations aimed at tracking the terrorist use of the proceeds of illicit activities. The key vulnerabilities I have just mentioned are present in the Americas. In Central America, moreover, several states have strengthened their counter-terrorism capacities, but few have established robust counter-terrorism legal frameworks, and most still face challenges relating to corruption, insufficient interagency cooperation, and lack of resources. And although all Central American states have established financial intelligence units, there is considerable variation in their levels of capacity, funding, staffing, and output. Central America remains vulnerable to the continued availability of powerful organized crime groups and drug cartels, which cause violence, erosion of the rule of law, and violations of human rights. In the Caribbean, the increased complexity of the possible links between terrorism and organized crime underscores the growing challenge to member states' capacity to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate terrorist cases and their links to transnational organized crime. Because of its geography, the sub-region is an attractive maritime transit route for the smuggling of drugs, small arms and light weapons, people, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear materials. In South America, member states have continued to make good progress in preventing and countering terrorism, but significant challenges remain. Despite the general perception that the terrorist threat to the region is low, the region remains vulnerable to terrorism financing, transnational organized crime, and the illicit cross-border movement of funds, arms, and people. A positive development we have observed is a significant degree of cooperation and information exchange between the financial intelligence units and the competent authorities, and many units cooperate with counterparts outside the region. In terms of criminal investigations, CTED is working to assess whether national prosecution offices have the authority, capacity, expertise, technical means, as well as human resources to handle complex terrorism cases. Throughout the whole region, we observe that many member states have yet to establish specialized teams with expertise to handle complex cases. And in some subregions, judicial and prosecutorial capacities and expertise remain limited. Effective strategies to disrupt the linkages between terrorism and organized crime require proper understanding and assessment of the risks and the adoption of risk-based approach. And moving forward, effective responses should include at least the following elements: comprehensive legal framework against terrorism, organized crime, and corruption, institutional capacity to carry out complex investigations, cooperation and partnership with the private sector and academia to understand and address the issue both strategically but also operationally. The member states of Latin America and the Caribbean have long been strong and consistent supporters of the work of the committee and CTED, and we very much value the dialogue we have with them. Just last week, my team of technical experts returned from a successful visit to Chile, where the government generously hosted a rich and constructive dialogue with their own technical experts and facilitated fruitful discussions with civil society and the private sector. Chile's sponsorship of today's event offers yet further evidence of its commitment to a multilateral approach to counterterrorism and to the region's capacity and willingness to play a leading role in shaping that approach. We look forward to hearing from our colleagues from UNICRI and CTED about their own findings and their joint report, and they will certainly offer new elements for our analysis and understanding of the terrorism crime nexus in the Americas, and will influence how we all move forward. I thank you all for joining this important event today. Thank you.
Thank you again, Assistant Secretary General, for your support. I now pass the floor to the Deputy Director of UNICRI, Mr. Leif Philipson. Leif, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ordman. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, UNICRI, to this extremely important event. I also believe this is actually the only side event focusing on the Americas during the Counter-Terrorism Week. In this regard, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Permanent Mission of Chile, as represented by Mr. René Alfonso Rodríguez Pérez, the Deputy Permanent Representative, and to the Assistant Secretary General, Mrs. Natalia German, the Executive Director of CTED, for their respective support in bringing this event together. I would also like to extend my thanks and appreciation to Mrs. Alison Treble, Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism of the Organization of America's States, OAS, for our many years of fruitful partnership and cooperation, the evidence of which is today's joint side event and the research that we will be presenting in a few minutes. Over the years, UNICRI, our action-oriented research on the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism, have repeatedly demonstrated that links or the nexus between the two are complex and very dynamic. These links tend to manifest in different various ways and often reflect distinct characteristics in different regions. On the other hand, increasing case studies reveal that the nexus has impacts across all regions, including the Americas, and I think we already got a few examples. I'm proud to say that UNICRI, in partnership with OAS, has been at the forefront of this work and will soon, as mentioned, publish a report on the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism in Latin America. The highlights and the main finding of which will be presented shortly by my colleague and UNICRI senior expert, Christian. Just a few words, and I promise just a few words about the background for UNICRI's work. Since 2016, UNICRI has been working, or probably also before 2016, has been working to address the nexus in line with the Security Council Resolution 2195. Back in 2017, UNICRI launched the so-called Nexus Initiative in cooperation with the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. Under this initiative, UNICRI developed the so-called The Hague Good Practices on the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism to provide member states and other interested stakeholders with recommendation and to assist them in developing policies and strategies to counter the nexus phenomena, and also to serve as the basis for international engagement, assistance, and technical cooperation and training, including the training that we are providing. Then following this, UNICRI developed the so-called policy toolkit on the Hague Good Practices on the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism. I think I have a copy, this one, which goes one step further in supporting practitioners and policymakers to put the identified good practices into action. This policy toolkit has a dual function. On the one hand, the first is to increase the knowledge and the awareness about the nexus by providing definition and different examples of its different manifestations in the different regions. And the second one, probably even more important, is to provide concrete action points to implement each of the 25 good practices that is included in this policy toolkit. Focus on the legal consideration, research, information sharing, local engagement and capacity building, and law enforcement. Since then, several regions across the globe have been using the policy toolkit, or UNICRI has used this policy toolkit for awareness raising, for technical support, and for capacity building activities. So diverse officials have benefited from these activities, including national practitioners, policymakers, law enforcement officers, and civil society representatives. We have also provided training to NATO and UN officers around the world. As you will see in this one, as we already discussed, the policy toolkit demonstrates that regional variation of the nexus are relevant to the Americas, also given the continent's breadth and diversity. And I think that's also a view that is supported by the new report that we will show in a second, or the research that will be published, by the way, in a couple of weeks. This research is another important part of UNICRI's contribution to our collective efforts to better understand and to combat the nexus. I will really encourage you all to read this new report and strive to implement within your own organization's mandates and the recommendations that is presented in this report. For our part, UNICRI will, going forward, seek to leverage the findings and the recommendation of this report to frame future programming, future activities in the region. And we really look forward to, and indeed, of course, rely on your support, cooperation, and partnership. I think I better stop here because we are already running a bit out of time. So I thank you all and wish you really an engaging and thought-provoking side events during the next hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leif, and thank you for your considerations of the time and agenda. So without further ado, we'll jump into the first of our substantive presentations. And I have the pleasure to introduce my own colleague, Mr. Christian Viana de Azevedo, who will be joining us virtually. And Christian will tell us a little bit about the findings of the report, the joint UNICRI OAS report that has been mentioned a few times in the opening remarks. Christian himself has been a special agent with the Brazilian Federal Police for the past 20 years. He's currently serving as the Undersecretary of Justice and Public Security for Intelligence and Integration within the Department of Justice and Public Security in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. He has an extensive experience in transnational crime investigations and counterterrorism, both in Brazil and overseas, and has written and published a number of articles and book chapters on this topic. We're very proud, as I mentioned, to have Christian as one of our senior fellows at UNICRI, where he's been supporting us since 2019 on the implementation of our program on the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism. So without further ado, I will hand over the floor to Christian to share with us some of the findings of the joint research. Christian, over to you.
Thank you, Audron. Thank you for the introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here to be able to be with you, sharing these findings and the organization of this report. We will address this issue, which is deemed to be such an important issue for our continent. Well, I'm going to share a quick presentation with you guys, and I'm not going to take much of your time. I'll be brief, I promise. Well, as everyone else that preceded me has already said about the Nexus, it's something that is one of the most pressing issues concerning to fighting terrorism and transnational organized crime in the whole globe nowadays, because the interactions between crime and terrorism, they have become more and more complex and more dynamic, and they depend and they vary according to characteristics of different regions across the globe. So something that we see in the Americas will be different from what we see in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and so on. But they will have a common denominator because it's their interest. So what are terrorist groups interested in crime? And why criminal organizations are interested in terrorism tactics? And that's those are some of the answers that we are looking for to answer in this report with this geographical cut in Latin America. What we have found is that as the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism in the Americas, they have been growing in the last 3 decades, and it truly contributes to the erosion of political, economic, social stability and development. And regardless the level of stability and development of a given country, the nexus is indeed a threat, as it will be clearly shown in the report with the concrete cases and everything. Well, the report is kind of a lengthy report, but it was basically structured in a way that we come from the very basics with introducing a methodology that we have used to address the nexus and how we conducted this research. Because this is a research that has, it's an academic research, so to speak, because we follow an academic methodology in order to validate and to legitimate our findings. So this research was mostly done from beginning with a historical perspective on the nexus on Latin America, in which we highlighted the most interesting and important events, processes, and institutes that contribute to us to understand the evolution of the nexus. And afterwards, we have reviewed a whole bunch of primary and secondary sources, such as books, articles, reports, narratives, media, and we then explored the relationship between nexus, between crime and terrorism. And in addition to assessing existing academic research, the data collection methodology also consisted in analyzing a series of primary sources. These sources, they included first-person reports, official reports that shed light on criminal activities carried out by criminal and terrorist groups. And those reports, of course, whenever declassified and available for research, they were used and referenced in this report. So we used the other declassified material, interviews with the key stakeholders, such as law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, military personnel, intel officers, experts, representatives from non-governmental organizations, think tanks, other professionals, and these interviews were conducted in a way in which we could validate and legitimate other open source material that we have used to enrich and enhance this report, which aims to illustrate the nexus in the continent. So after this historical context and this brief introduction, we assess the nexus and how it has evolved in Latin America and what point are we at. And in order to illustrate at what point are we at, we decided to bring to light some cases, explain some cases that were deemed to be important for illustrating how Nexus operates in the continent. And of course, these cases are not an exhaustive list. It's just an illustration. So we picked up a few of them, some of them that have happened 30 years ago to some of them that are happening right now. So in a historical timeline, we took care of this in order to show the evolution of the Nexus, to pick some cases that they have come to light 30 years ago to some cases that are actually happening nowadays. And these cases, we have divided them into two different sets of cases. One of them is terrorist organizations and the Nexus, or terrorist organizations and their usage of criminal enterprises in order to advance their ideological goals in what we call the terrorist activity cycle, which is basically from recruiting, radicalizing, doing the logistics, to financing, to the attack, into the post-attack actions. And in all of these actions, how does crime and terror, they do interact? And in order to actually have a more specific set of cases, we have deemed more important to present three axes. One is drug trafficking and the Nexus, in which we present some cases in Latin America covering those. Another one is money laundering and the Nexus. And the third one, and the final one, is migrant smuggling and the Nexus, because we have realized that these are the most pressing issues as for the Nexus in the continent, in Latin American continent. And following that analysis, we also illustrated some cases in which criminal organizations are use terrorist tactics to advance their goals, their profit-making goals, as Mrs. Allison has highlighted, Mr. Leif Willitsen has done so. And we have chosen 4 criminal groups that are not only national important groups for some in some countries, Brazil and Mexico, but also groups that they have a transnational dimension, which is Primeiro Comando da Capital, PCC, Comando Vermelho, CV, Sinaloa Cartel, and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Well, after that, we jump into the conclusion and then a set of recommendations that they came from experiences with based on interviews with a lot of people that were involved in this research, and also experiences from the reports, the dozens of reports that we have read and analyzed, the declassified reports, to understand how we should develop our nations, our countries, in order to fight the Nexus. And one thing we have to highlight here, and you have to be very clear, the definition of terrorism that we use is not based on any of the Latin American countries' definitions. It's an academic definitions that it's an umbrella that has been used for any given country to develop its counterterrorism legislation. So it's a broader definition in which encompasses all sorts of nexus cases that might happen in Latin America. So as Mr. Leif-Villetens has already shed light on this, some of the recommendations that we brought up and we think they are key are the ones here that I have put in this slide. Like the disruption of finance and logistics is key in dismantling criminal, insurgent, and terrorist organizations. So if we do not act on breaking their backbone, which is finance and logistics, these organizations, they will remain powerful. So this is one of the key recommendations that we came up with. Also, efficient interinstitutional cooperation and coordination at both national and international level is really critical for more effective actions. This might be something very obvious, but actually playing that on the field in a day-to-day, in a routine sense, it's not that easy. It has to be developed gradually. And also another one that we think it's very important and it's pivotal is the collaboration with the private sector, the civil society, multilateral organizations, and academia, because all these other actors, they will help broaden the threat knowledge and provide strategic tools. Also, the political commitment is crucial for strengthening strategic actions to fight organized crime and terrorist movements. Countries in the region and helped by the UN, the OAS, can help assist countries in becoming more aware of the threat and therefore more politically committed in strengthening strategic actions. And that comes when one recognizes the threat that we are facing. So an ample recognition, ample in a way that Latin American recognition of the threat by local governments and private actors that are involved directly or indirectly in countering crime and terrorism is essential. What one country deems to be a threat, if the other one that is a partner in countering it does not deem to be that much of a threat, so this cooperation will be half-hearted, so to speak. So we need to get the countries basically to share a common recognition of the threat. And that also comes to another point, which is the intelligence collection and criminal proceeding evidence collection that should be treated differently, since intelligence information presented as evidence in criminal proceedings by LE officers is a controversial practice. And we've seen throughout the world that there is a bit of a confusion sometimes, especially in law enforcement agencies, how to use intelligence and criminal evidence strategically to proceed with the case. And in some cases, the usage of intelligence collection may hamper its success. So officers, judges, and prosecutors, they also, it's very important that they are trained in understanding what intelligence collection is in criminal proceeding, and it's possible or its impossibility to be used in criminal proceedings as a tool for countering the nexus. Another one that is something that has been a core business of UNICRI is expanding training opportunities to address the crime-terror nexus and raising the awareness for the nexus in a given region. In this case, in Latin America, we have realized that countries, they assess the nexus in different ways with different degrees of importance. So expanding training opportunities, it's a very effective way to address the threat, to make people understand and to open dialogue avenues into understanding what the nexus really is. Also promoting the adoption of legislation against terrorism and transnational crime in accordance with international standards, according to the United Nations international treaties and conventions, as well as United Nations Security Council resolutions and the recommendations of the International Financial Action Task Force. This is something of key importance to make the countries to be on the same page. So that also paves a smooth way of cooperation among countries, among different international agencies and domestic agencies as well. And this also is helped by tools such as fusion centers. So fusion centers, they do optimize intelligence work while multi-agency task forces enhance operational work. So having fusion centers for intelligence work as well as multilateral multi-agency task forces, we both will have a clear enhancement of capabilities, both in intelligence-wise and operational-wise. And also one thing that we can observe across the world, also it's not only something that happens in Latin America, is that government agencies with different mandates, some of them with a counter-crime mandate versus a counter-terrorism mandate, should be able to work in tandem when faced with a terrorist threat. One of those that are within the terrorist activity cycle, which is something that will be well explained in the report. So whenever you have a radicalization, a recruitment, financing, and everything that involves crime and involves a terrorist group meshed with the criminal world, and sometimes the same case is investigated by agencies that whose mandate is a countercrime and another one whose mandate is counterterrorism, they should be able to work together because quite some cases they are sharing the same targets, they are working on the same investigation, and what happens is that they are doing efforts separate from each other when they could just join efforts and be much more effective. And these are just some of the recommendations. I mean, these are the ones that we consider to be key recommendations for this report, but also others will pop up and will come up as we start working more closely together with different countries, with different agencies, with different mandates. And as well as the aim of this report is to raise this awareness and to be able to shed a light as for Latin America on how the threat of the Nexus is real, and the threat of the Nexus, as the ones that spoke before me, they highlighted so well that it's been growing, and it's something that it's not possible that one country fights this alone. It's just possible to diminish the harm of this threat if we fight this thing together. So together as a region, together as a force, with not only governments but also multilateral organizations like the UN agencies and OAS, also the private sector, as I have mentioned, the academia. And that's the reason that a academic report like this gives us an opportunity to learn more, to be able to discuss more about this important. Well, I'm not going to extend any longer because you have actually said everything that I needed to be said before me. And I just wanted to briefly introduce our report, which will be released soon. Thank you very much.
As has been mentioned, the report will be finalized in the next couple of weeks, and of course we will be distributing a copy of it all electronically to all of you who've registered for the side event. So I hope and encourage you all take a look at this report as soon as it's released. With that, I'll hand over to my colleague Fernanda Sarmiento from OAS, who will take us into the next part of the side event. Fernanda, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oran. And thank you very much, Christian, for your presentation. And now I would like to present Mr. Juan Cruz Ponce, Deputy Executive Secretary, Financial Action Task Force of Latin America, GAFILAT. Mr. Ponce is a lawyer and has a master's in law and economics. He served as the former head of the Department of International Representation of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Argentina. He possesses an extensive experience in assessing Latin American countries in their implementation of the anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing international standards, as well as in providing technical assistance on anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financial matters. Thank you, Juan Cruz, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fernanda, and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to start by thanking not only UNICRI and CTED and CTED for this kind invitation to share our experiences, but also to all the delegates that share the interest in this very important matter. My presentation has two components. One of them is very general, so please be patient, and the other one jumps into the specific issue that we have seen in our assessments. Fernanda, I know that we are short on time, so please, if you see that I exceed my time, please jump in and let me know. And having said this, I should introduce GAFILAT to you. Many of you maybe know about that, but it's important to notice that GAFILAT is the Financial Action Task Force of Latin America. It is not an operational body, but a FARAF-style regional body. This means that this organization that comprises 18 member countries across the Latin American region has the mandate of promoting and also assessing the level of implementation of the international AML and CTF standards across the region. It is part of the global network of the FARAF and was created in 2000, so we have more than 20 years of existence. As I said, the main purpose of GAFILAT is to understand to what extent our member countries fulfill, comply, and implement the AML and CFT international standards. And this is done through what is named as a round of assessments that takes many years to be completed. We have 18 member countries. Now we are in the final stage of the fourth round of mutual evaluation. We have assessed successfully 14 out of the 18 member countries, and the other 4 countries are in process of being assessed. 2 of them are in a very initial stage, such as Argentina and El Salvador, that have just started, and the other 2 countries in process are Brazil as well as Bolivia, which are in an intermediate stage of the assessment. The assessment is a general framework and a general picture on the level of compliance and effectiveness of any AML and CFT regime. In this image, you can see, for example, the general outcomes regarding the technical compliance of our assessments. In this chart, you can see, for example, the first 20 recommendations of the FARAF. And if you have a quick look, you can see that it's mainly green. This means that our region is performing very well in a technical view or perspective. That means that most of the regulations, procedures, and the system in place, it's in accordance to the technical requirements of the FARAF recommendation. Here I highlighted 2 specific recommendations, which are the recommendation 1 and 5, that relates to the specific matter of this forum. The first recommendation regards to the identification and assessment of the money laundering and terrorist financing risk in the country, while the recommendation number 5 relates to the criminalization of TF. Generally speaking, we can see that we have a good performance in our 14 assessed countries. The same happens with the other set of recommendations from recommendation 21 to 40, and this covers not only preventive measures, duty to report transactions to the FIU, but also international cooperations. In general, you can see that the ratings are appropriate, mostly compliance. However, when it comes to the important issue which relates to the implementation of the standards in practice, we can see here that there are several important challenges. I have to clarify that this is not a specific problem of Latin American region. If you go across the 9 FSRBs, you will find very similar challenges and levels of compliance and effectiveness, and even in many far-off countries. Effectiveness, it's a global issue, and we can see also the effects that it has in our region. Here you can see the immediate outcome 1 and immediate outcome 9, which are connected to the recommendations I already expressed. In the first one, which is immediate outcome 1, you can see that most of the countries are having a moderate level of effectiveness, which is not a very positive rating. The same happens with immediate outcome 9, which is related to the extent to which our member countries are detecting, investigating, as well as prosecuting and convicting for terrorism financing. Again, this is a global problem and not specific of our country. In this specific slide, you can see very clearly this contrast between the technical compliance on the one hand and the effectiveness or the outcomes that are being achieved in practice on the other hand. At the left, you can see that 86% of our membership that have been assessed performed very well with the technical compliance. On the opposite, you can see that regarding effectiveness, only 21% of the countries got a good outcome in terms of effectiveness. And this is specifically connected to the recommendation 1, which is the identification, assessment, and understanding of risks in the country, and also the application of mitigation measures commensurate to the identified risks. The same happens, you can see, with the recommendation 5. It means the criminalization of TF in our countries versus the level of investigations and sanctions of TF crimes. Here you can see that recommendation 5 is largely being fulfilled by our member countries, with only 14% of non-compliant countries or partly compliant countries. But on the other hand, you have the extent to which our member countries are investigating, detecting, and prosecuting TF, and the proportion of compliance, it's the opposite. Only 21% are receiving positive or substantial outcomes in terms of effectiveness. What are the main challenges related to both the identification and assessment and also the prosecution of TF offenses? Well, when you analyze our assessments, you can find a lot of common challenges. For example, the TF risk assessments are not as developed or depth as the countries conduct the money laundering risk assessments. There are some limitations in terms of resources and also in terms of training that limit also the capacity of the law enforcement authorities to effectively understand the risk and also to detect these conducts. And sometimes the policies are not fully consistent with the risk profiles of the country. It also happens that there are not many protocols or guidelines for law enforcement agencies in order to duly or properly prioritize the investigations and prosecution of cases related to TF. There is also a lack of adequate specialization in some organizations. There are challenges also in terms of domestic cooperation and coordination of actions across the relevant stakeholders, but also in the international cooperation field, among other very important challenges that I can see that are also reflected in this very important report that you are launching in this matter. Here you can see also how our assessed countries have considered the TF risks. Most of our member countries consider that the general risk of TF is medium, but you also have some countries we consider that the risk could be medium to high, medium to low, low, or there are also 2 countries that could not determine the specific risk. The positive thing is that 100% of the assessed countries have conducted a TF risk assessment. Most of them jointly with the money laundering risk assessment, but still this is a very positive aspect in comparison to the previous years. But still we have much to do in this regard, and this is why I think that this specific report with the nexus of organized crime and TF is very, very important and will play a very critical role for strengthening the capacities and the level of understanding of our member countries. What happens with our assessments? Well, you have, as I said, 14 member countries that have been assessed already by GAFILAT, and in 4 out of these 14 member countries, we have found that there are specific connections between organized crime and TF crime. And this is also reflected in these 4 reports, which are the Colombian, the Peruvian, Ecuador, and the Paraguay reports that are publicly available. You can get it either from the GAFILAT website or FARAF website, and are both in Spanish as well as in English. Here you will have some examples of the findings. This is the National Risk Assessment of Colombia, the last one, which was relatively recent, where specific domestic terrorist and TF threats are related to organized armed groups, as well as residual organized armed groups, which are called GAOs. I can imagine that you already know what it means that there are armed irregular groups acting within the country. It was found by this risk assessment that there are strong links between these groups and also illegal sources of funds that arise from drug trafficking, smuggling, extortion, and also illegal mining. There are also some regional threats that have been identified by these countries that relates to the drug cartel from other important countries in the region. You also have the report of Ecuador, and I'm about to complete my presentation. And Ecuador, in its risk assessment, also found that there are some links between the organized crime and TF activities in the country, but these are more related to the activities of armed groups in a neighboring country, and this has an impact in bordering provinces, and there is evidence that these groups are having also labs for producing cocaine and also committing other crimes. And there were not many cases, but there was also a bombing case, very famous in the country, according to the report. Here you can find this document and also the specific report in the GAFILAT site. Then you have also Peru that have found that there are also some threats. For example, the domestic armed organization that you all must know, which is Sendero Luminoso, maintains some ties with criminal organizations which are dedicated also to drug trafficking and also carry out other types of illegal acts such as extortion, collaboration with illegal mining, logging, and also to providing protection and over the production quotas of farmers. And then you have also, lastly, the case of Paraguay, which is our last assessment that was approved very recently. And there were several threats identified, such as the domestic threats led by these specific armed groups, which are the army of the people, the Paraguayan people, and also well, it's in Spanish, Agrupación Campesina Armada, as well as the Ejército del Mariscal López, which are criminal also organizations that commit terrorist attacks, and they are all self-funded by crimes such as kidnapping, robbery, and extortion. It is interesting that this specific risk assessment, which is also online, recognizes that there are also some international threats, and there is a specific organization that has been recognized as a terrorist organization by this country, which is Hezbollah and its supporters, that was specifically identified in the country as a threat. And also a very important factor, which is the geographical factor, makes reference to the specific risks stemming from the TBA, or Three-Border Area, which is, as you can suppose, a concern among many of our member countries. So this is my presentation, and of course, I'm looking forward to contributing in any way we can. In this regard, we look forward to receiving the report and contributing also to its dissemination among our member countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Juan Cruz, for your important remarks and on a different perspective of the Nexus. And now it is my pleasure to present Ms. Esther Zubiri. She's a United Nations Security Council expert on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban analytical support and sanctions monitoring team. Previously, she worked as a state attorney chief in Spain, specialized in counterterrorism and its financing and sanctions regimes, leading the investigation and prosecution of the M11 attacks. She served as Chief of Justice, Human Rights and Rule of Law in the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, and as a senior legal specialist at the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, UNOCT, and also in the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism of the Organization of American States. Please, Esther, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, and it's a pleasure being here. First of all, I want to thank OAS, CTED, and UNICRI for inviting us, and also the Permanent Mission of Chile. And I also want to really congratulate Brazil and Ecuador for the excellent work they are doing in the Security Council, as an expert of the Security Council, and especially Ecuador, which is the chair of the 1988 committee, which is regarding to the threat of the Taliban in Afghanistan. My presentation, without further ado, is going to be very operational, because the monitoring team, for the ones that are not very familiarized for our work, we are the group of experts that assess the threat of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, and also are in charge of the implementations of the sanction regimes for all these, the two terrorist groups and the Taliban, which within the United Nations system is not considered a terrorist organization, although other member states consider themselves terrorist organizations. I'm going to explain 4 cases related to the linkages of terrorism with drug trafficking, human trafficking or migrant smuggling, arms trafficking, and cultural heritage, if I have time. The most vigorous ISIL regional networks are located in Afghanistan, which is the Al-CTED office, Somalia, Al-Qarrar office, and the Lake Chad Basin's Al-Furqan office. We are going to show 3 cases that refer to operations and activities that involve 2 of these offices and have linkages with Latin America. So it will show that the connections exist and the threat of terrorists and connections with organized crime in Latin America is also a reality. Besides Al-Qaeda and ISIL, another of my clients are the Taliban. Right now, Taliban is not a listed entity, it's the Haqqani network. And at least 58 sanctions individuals are holding now cabinet or senior level positions in the current de facto Taliban administration. You have seen there the Taliban. I'm going to address first the nexus and the linkages between drug trafficking and terrorist financing, and how it's affecting also the Americas. Very briefly, I just need to say that if you can see by the graphic, the Afghan traffickers and the Taliban are doing around $140 to $170 million, in some estimates even almost $2 billion in terms of the trafficking of opium and heroin. But now methamphetamine, as is proven in our last report on the Taliban, is as profitable as heroin. 375 tons of heroin is produced and trafficked out of Afghanistan each year. You can see this graphic and you can see the routes. The major, the Haqqani network, which are the listed individuals that you have seen previously, are leading the trafficking of heroin and methamphetamine, and the networking closely with criminal network syndicates in Southeast and Central Asia to smuggle heroin and fentanyl to Europe and to the United States. If you see, this is the global heroin flows of Asian origins. It's very interesting that you can see there is the Silk Route that is in Central Asia, the Balkans route that goes through Turkey, and from there goes to Europe, the Southeast Asia route that basically put together Pakistan also, and Middle East and Africa, and ends in Europe and the USA. And we will see now in a clear example how the Southeast Asia route is connected with the US drug trafficking markets in the US through Taliban link individuals. If you see, this is one of my clients, Abdul Sattar Abdul Manan. This is an alleged Afghan narco-terrorist who was prosecuted and convicted by the Southern District of New York as a narco trafficker that is funding the Taliban through a very complex network that basically has extend its tentacles into Australia and both the drug from Australia to the United States, and with that was funded the Taliban. They also used the Balkan route, and actually he was extradited in Estonia. If you can see in the images, those seals that are in the packages are seals that granted the protection of the Haqqani network and the Taliban, so they secure that when this drug is trafficking around the world, the permits will be clear by those organized crime networks that work with them. Actually, Manan came to the United States, and through these two Australian associates that work with them, moved the money from New York to Kabul using an Australian-based money transmitting business. If you can see, this is it's really having an impact in terms of how the Taliban are financing themselves through the drug trafficking and how the involvement of in the Americas that happened. But if I want to be very brief because I know that the time is pushing. Besides that example that illustrate, we will now jumping into another drug trafficking route. This is the cocaine route. And how you see the circuits of the cocaine route that goes basically from the Americas and then to Europe and to the West Africa, basically Senegal and Spain are the entrance of Europe. And what basically I'm going to illustrate that is how the cocaine route is used by returning foreign terrorist fighters in their way back to the Western Hemisphere. This is basically the movement of the map that illustrates how the movement of people or individuals that are in national watch list are moving basically from Middle East, Syria and Iraq, through Turkey, and then going basically to the Caribbean and also in several hot spots, including the Darien area and Guatemala. I'm going to illustrate that with a clear example on how the threat exists. This individual basically is a fugitive from ISIL and was arrested in an airport of El Dorado in Bogota, Colombia. And he was one of the major commanders of ISIL Vladimir Ali Taranete. And basically, he was trying to get into the United States to establish a ISIL's cell there, and actually also engage with some organized crime networks in terms of recruiting fighters to bring them back to Syria and Iraq, and also to bring money. Basically, he was supposed to go from Turkey to Guatemala, and then from Guatemala go through irregular borders, land borders, through Mexico, and from there to the United States. The problem is that he has a layover in Colombia. Why they choose Guatemala? Because Guatemala doesn't have advanced passenger information and passenger name record systems. So the Interpol database and special notice and red notice where this individual was included, and also in our sanctioned list, it wouldn't show up when he crossed the border. But unfortunately, he has a layover in Colombia. And during the layover, instead of going to the duty-free to spend some money, he thought he was just arrived to the final destination. So basically what he did is he went through borders. Immediately, Interpol, the alarm goes, they notifies us, they notifies Interpol, and basically they were disrupting, his entrance in Guatemala and from there to the United States. I want to show those examples because, as I said, the threat exists, and Latin American it could turn little by little and a very threatening scenario if those returning fighting continue in their way back to the Western Hemisphere. But I'm going to add two more examples, and this one is a very good operation that the Brazilian police and the federal prosecutors in 2018 charged and convicted 11 people were planning to establish an Islamic State cell in Brazil and trying to recruit jihadists to send to Syria, and basically using also migrant smuggling networks to send them back to Syria. Actually, how the Brazilian police track those cells was through their social media, after the Spanish Guardia Civil provide telephone numbers found on a Brazilian arrested individual that was belonging to ISIL, and through that WhatsApp group, they were able to dismantle that cell. And it's also a clear example how ISIL is trying to establish cells in the country. Coming into the linkages between terrorism and trafficking and armed trafficking in Latin America, this is an individual, and I'm going to explain in detail. Is not already a listed individual in our sanctioned list. We are in the process of investigating, but this individual, basically Osama Abdelmongi Abdelkaharbak, was a senior ISIS leader, contacted this individual and basically offered him to put him in ISIL's payroll in order to get from the embassy of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea in Brazil some weaponry and anti-drone technology to send it back to ISIL. Basically, this individual was paid nearly $30,000 per month until he will finish his task. Also, the individual was detained, and this operation was dismantled, but actually ISIL is trying to do those contacts in terms of the act trafficking through those networks. Another example, we refer to ISIL and now turning to Al-Qaeda, although I have to say that this is just an OFAC listed individual and basically is not included in the United Nations Consolidated Sanctions List. It's a Brazilian network of individuals reportedly, and I say reportedly because, as I said, it's not included in our sanctions list, linked to Al-Qaeda. Basically, they were operating in the countries. One of them, Al-Maghrabi, was the Al-Qaeda liaison officer in Brazil and was linked to Osama bin Laden. The other one, the one that is in the news in the chart, is basically was working and involved in counterfeit currency printing and basically through two companies that he was administration, one of them a company of furniture. And the third one was a Lebanese-born. He was running a non-governmental organization, Open Books Islamic Nucleus, that basically will try to assist Syrian refugees, but basically was funding training camps in Syria. And the last one I want to show is the Barakat clan, although the Barakat clan is as Matt Harakat. Barakat, as you know, is a U.S.-designated key Hezbollah financer, and although Hezbollah is not a terrorist organization under the United Nations, other organizations like the OAS and, of course, United States, Europe have determined that. But I want to go further because I cannot elaborate on Hezbollah since it's not in my mandate. But it happens that one of the companies that Assad and Matt Barakat was running, Mondial War Engineering and Constructions, with offices in Ciudad del Este and Beirut, was sending donations to Al-Qaeda through real estate fraud proceeds. Basically, Barakat also donated to several orphanages, and it was a way of financing bin Laden. Later, he was detained and arrested in Paraguay and extradited, basically. So, and this was one of the networks they were using through used cars, trace money laundering schemes in terms of bringing those finances not only to Hezbollah, but as I said, also to Al-Qaeda. And the last one is just a heads up on the change in the trend of the art trafficking networks. If you can see, those are right now the normal trends of how the art trafficking networks that finance or are linked to the financing of terrorism operate. We, the monitoring team, have the mandate also to trace and to monitor every illegal trafficking of cultural property that is related to terrorist financing. Recently, after the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, some of the Bamiyan Buddhas that still were artifacts that were remaining were advertised in several Facebook and other dark web pages. And specifically, two of these examples were involving buyers that were located in Latin America. So this is also an example of how groups that their normal scenario is Afghanistan, is Syria, is Iraq, is Africa, also are involved with organized crime networks in Latin America. I hope I have been brief enough and didn't steal that much time, and open to questions. I just want to say that in terms of the presentation, I'm okay for the distribution, but I will appreciate that this will be under the Chatham rules, because for the nature of our role as a monitoring team, as you know, that we deal directly with intelligence bodies of member states, we are not allowed to disclose our sources, and basically we need to bring that in this way, as well as the charge that you have seen of the listed Taliban individuals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esther, for your presentation. Very interesting, all the information. And now I would like to present Mr. Rafael Marcus, who is a senior analyst at the New York City Police Department Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau, where he oversees a team of analysts that support counterterrorism investigations that focus primarily on the Middle East and South Asia. He is also a non-resident research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he received his PhD. Welcome, Mr. Marcus, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And I'm here, I know, last but not least, just to give you, I would like to discuss sort of the crime-terrorism nexus and how that looks in the United States, focusing primarily on two central case studies, again, from a bit more of an operational perspective, looking at ISIS as well as what we call racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists or domestic terrorists. And I think, you know, from an organizational perspective, we heard from our previous distinguished speakers lots of great examples of how organizations due to mutual convenience, mutual interest, profits, etc., cooperate with one another. But what I'd like to do is sort of discuss the crime-terrorism nexus from a grassroots perspective. I must say, just as a disclaimer, I'm here on an impersonal capacity, and nothing that I say is official opinion of the NYPD, just out of the way. But regarding the grassroots level, what do I mean by that? And I think everyone here is very familiar with the wave of ISIS attacks that went through Europe, whether it's the Bataclan, Charlie Hebdo, almost 10 years ago, believe it or not. And I think it was a real eye-opener regarding the pervasiveness and the integration of crime and terrorism in those attacks. It was a real eye-opener. The perpetrators used trademark counterfeiting in Charlie Hebdo to buy weapons, drug sales to buy the getaway car. In the Bataclan, there was a fraudulent document ring from organized crime figures to help the attackers gain entry to the country. And this really, as well as great case studies in the UK, the horrible Manchester Arena bombing, where Libyan, British drug trafficking gangs were integral in procuring explosives and really integral to hiding the getaway car, etc. But this was really the eye-opening for us regarding what looks like the crime-terrorism nexus on the grassroots level, and that's really more individualized, it's more localized, there's a lighter footprint, so it's not necessarily organizational, it's more small networks, it's harder to detect from a practitioner perspective. So that's sort of what I mean by the grassroots level. And just to sort of highlight a sort of simple methodological framework for how we understand the crime-terrorism nexus, which might be useful in sort of clarifying our understanding more broadly. And really, it's four-pronged, which is all four relatively straightforward, but really I think sort of help give us some rigor in how we examine this problem if you're sort of tasked to mitigate it. Number one is the prevalence of criminal history in attack perpetrators. We know that the type of criminal history is also very important. And I'll give you some in-depth sort of case studies from the ISIS data set in the United States. The second is sort of the use of crime to fundraise or for plot logistics. And again, this was very, very prominent in Europe, procuring equipment through fraud, through petty criminal activity, facilitating travel of foreign fighters, etc. The third is the role of gangs, not only for recruitment, but also radicalization, criminal activity, logistics, transferring lessons learned, relevant skills. And lastly, the fourth is the role of prisons. Of course, we all know about prison radicalization and also its utility for fostering relationships of utility, meaning you meet on the inside in prison. When you get out, you link back up. And these are really the four this is sort of the framework for how we understand this issue, drawing very much from that European, what they had to deal with in 2015, 2013, all those ISIS attacks. Now, we conducted an academic study primarily, or rather I should say entirely from open source, looking at the ISIS data set in the United States, meaning every individual arrested on a terrorism offense where the allegation or the association to ISIS was specifically mentioned in the public, in court documents, we looked at them. There's 237. It's probably upwards of 250 since we stopped, since the study was published in various academic journals. And what we wanted to do was examine those four pillars that I just discussed of the crime-terrorism nexus. So when you look at the criminal history, because in Europe, the perpetrators of all those attacks had extensive criminal records, the dreaded, known to law enforcement after the fact. When we looked here, we had about 1/3 of those who ended up being arrested for attempting to carry out an attack or travel overseas had a criminal record. So again, not quite as prevalent, not quite as pervasive as we might see in other contexts, but within the ISIS data set, it was only about 1/3. What was interesting is that the type of crime is what really matters. A criminal record unto itself has some value, but really the diagnostic importance of the type of arrest, the type of crime the one was involved in, has much more impact to better assess individuals of concern. And truthfully, about 20% of the entire data set had a violent criminal past, as well as of those with a criminal record. So of that third, 2/3 of that were recidivists, meaning multiple arrests, with the average number of arrests of those with a criminal record was about 3 per person. So these are people that continuously pop up on police radar. This is important, number one, in the criminological research. Those who recidivists reoffend at a higher rate and are more likely to commit violent crimes than those without a criminal past. So these are the sorts of kinds of things, when you're really in the weeds, these kinds of things are important to consider. When it came to the types of violent crimes, again, it's not predictive, but it certainly has diagnostic value. We had a prevalence of domestic violence as well as firearms offenses of those who ended up getting involved and arrested for terrorism offenses. So we know that there is a lot of, there's been in sort of the terrorism literature this understanding that family violence, domestic violence, and violence towards women has sort of been a commonality. We saw the same thing with, and of course those who have resorted to violence in the past, more attuned to violence in the future. There's a shorter, what we would call maybe a flash to bang period if you are already attuned to using violence, more likely to sort of fall back on violence again. There's an enhanced risk of future violence. When it came to firearms offenses, we have a very problematic, firearms are everywhere in the United States. And it turned out that about 20% of those with a criminal record had a prior firearms offense. Obviously, that's concerning, and it speaks for itself, given that those who end up becoming radicalized, of those who had criminal records, 20% had firearms offense previously, whether trafficking, assault with a firearm, criminal possession of a firearm. But why that's important is that those with a firearms offense in their history were twice as likely to try and procure a firearm for use in an attack. So it seems to influence weapon choice to a degree. Of course, we know connections to the criminal underworld to procure firearms in other countries is an operational trend that we've seen a lot of in the United States. You don't need to go to the criminal underworld; you can just go to a gun store. So a little bit different. Regarding the utility of criminality and plot-relevant criminality in this sort of ISIS data set, unlike Europe, we did not see crime used as often as we were expecting regarding financing or logistics. There was a small number of cases that used armed robbery, illegal firearm sales, drug trafficking to fundraise for attacks. The one that we saw the most of was financial crimes, which sort of speaks to the importance of the work that everybody here is doing. But why financial fraud, or why are financial crimes the most prevalent when it comes to this? It's likely because it's easy. You can do it alone, relatively low risk, do it from the computer, relatively low tech. We've also seen credit card and bank fraud sort of repeatedly regarding for terrorist financing, increasingly cryptocurrency. We've made some big cases here regarding the use of crypto for terrorist financing. And very interestingly, there was a whole network of guys in Minnesota, Somali Americans who sought to travel to Syria, and they had funded the majority of their travel through student financial aid fraud, meaning the money that they have to use to go to university, they were fraudulently rediverting that to buy bus tickets and plane tickets. Very different than what we saw in Europe, very different than the South and Central American context regarding the use of crime. When it comes to gangs, again in the United States, similar group dynamics, community characteristics, and underlying mechanisms that draw people both to gangs and to terrorist networks, sort of those underlying trends from a psychological, sociological perspective are similar. But we really, in the United States, when it came to gangs, those who were involved in gangs ultimately left the gang when they radicalized. Unlike Europe and other places, South and Central America, you really see that integration, those strong connections between extremist groups and gangs, either for procurement of weapons, for materials, for logistics. Generally, those who had a gang background gravitated away from it, which was sort of an interesting finding in the American context. And there's lots of very interesting cases in the United States that sort of highlight that. Again, this is all within the ISIS data set, 250 cases. Then when it comes to prison, historically, we all know prison is an incubator and a place where terrorist and criminal networks converge, and everybody is locked up behind bars right next to each other. And we know about push and pull factors within prison, where poor conditions, the need for protection, charismatic inmates within prison, which sort of radicalize inmates. And we did have some more than we thought cases of prison radicalization in the United States. By and large, about half of those with a criminal record served time in prison, and of that, about 18% did actually radicalize in prison, but all were very, very easily attributable to the presence of a non-isolated, charismatic terrorist inmate who's already, been convicted on terrorism offenses. You sort of not isolated, milling around inside the prison, able to sort of radicalize people. Again, this is not a widespread phenomenon in the U.S. I think in other countries and other areas, prison radicalization for recruitment is much more important. But we had plenty of cases, and again, it was primarily because of that, the charismatic inmates. Sometimes we had, prison, an important component to solidify plot-relevant relationships where people who met inside then linked up afterwards to attempt to travel together. And very, very interestingly, plotting did continue inside prison, meaning someone arrested on a terrorism offense is incarcerated, and they'll very often, they're still radical, continue to try and plot in whatever way they can from inside, whether to attack a corrections officer, a jail guard, a prison guard. And even more interestingly, very often, though that plotting is thwarted by other inmates who are angling for their own cooperation, their own seeking credit for cooperation. So these guys will stay radical, try and carry out either low-tech attacks or very highfalutin attacks sometimes, but very often other inmates are the ones who notify authorities. So with that, sort of like within the ISIS context, but just to sort of illustrate how this framework is applicable beyond the ISIS context to other elsewhere across the ideological spectrum, we looked, again, we looked sort of anecdotally at the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists or domestic terrorists, which in the United States would include neo-Nazis and white supremacists and those who are targeting, based on ethnicity or nationality. And in a way, the statistics were totally different. Where in the ISIS case study, it was about 30% had a criminal past. Just sort of, again, anecdotally, and methodologically, this would be tricky because what to include in your larger data set without a domestic terrorism statute in the United States, sort of side issue. But if you look at a group like the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, sort of a neo-Nazi-inspired group that's prevalent across the Midwest United States, criminal history and criminality, drug trafficking, methamphetamine trafficking, weapons trafficking, absolutely rampant, with upwards of 70% of these guys have a criminal past. They're also an integral part of sort of the prison system in the United States. There's over 100 sort of racially, ethnically motivated extremist prison gangs active across the U.S. in this regard. And if you want to look at the crime-terrorism nexus from a really granular operational/tactical perspective, these sort of trends are quite worrying, and they're very impactful on the recruitment, retention, and acculturation of these kinds of characters into the group. There was a takedown, a federal case made in the U.S. and Texas in 2017. They arrested 89 members of the Aryan Brotherhood. Again, this is just a case study. And of those 89, based on their total criminal histories combined, there was roughly 730 arrests between the 89 of them. So this is sort of very, very different. Only 6 of the 89 had no criminal past. When you look at the ISIS data set, it was almost 50% had no criminal past. The Aryan Brotherhood very active in murders, not necessarily ideologically, meaning like as domestic terrorism, but based on criminal motives and knocking off rivals. So you really have a very different ecosystem. But again, that methodological framework for looking at the crime-terrorism nexus can be quite informative and animating. Of course, so that we talked about gangs, talked about prisons, the utility of crime. These groups, are making lots of money involved in trafficking, not only in the Midwest, but I think also on the U.S. southern border, which touches, of course, impacts Central and South America and criminal elements there. So I think that sort of, I was cognizant of the time, sort of highlights, ideological differences, that the crime-terrorism nexus is ever present, different shades of gray, some places stronger, some places weaker. Hopefully I highlighted sort of the importance of the grassroots crime-terrorism nexus, where we know at the big level, organizationally, these groups always have mutual interests and profit, et cetera, but on the grassroots level, what draws the individual which in a way is the most important from a mitigation perspective, what draws them into the group. And I think just, for possible, takeaways, some of these organizational initiatives that were mentioned in this report, like fusion centers and bringing criminal investigators and terrorism investigators together. I was glad to hear that conclusion in the report. It's a tried and tested and successful method for mitigating some of this. And then on the individual level, there's all sorts of initiatives regarding anti-gang initiatives, off-ramping within the prison system, prison rehabilitation, and these are all very, very complex issues, which I know everyone here is aware of and involved in. But this was all sort of contribute to ultimately mitigating this threat and weakening sort of the crime terrorism nexus. So thank you for listening, and I was honored to be here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marcos, for your remarks. And I pass it over to Lina Cepeda.
Thank you very much. We are aware that we're out of time. We're running late. Sorry about that. Thank you, everyone, for staying here and also online. We just want to know if maybe there's a question or two if the panel could take very quickly. And if not, we can we pass to closing remarks. But if there's any question, we have one question, so please take the microphone.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I just had a very brief question. I don't want to keep everyone. For Christian, I wanted to ask him what the status of the judicial investigations in the region is that proves the nexus.
Thank you for the question. I'll say that the status is that across the region, we have seen successful investigations on nexus cases, being investigations that targeted directly terrorism financing or facilitation, or indirectly through the crimes that support terrorism. For instance, in Brazil, there were quite a few operations against Hezbollah clan members that were using drug trafficking and arms trafficking and money laundering to advance their ideological goals elsewhere, that they were disrupted by well-done investigations conducted to thwart their drug trafficking networks, arms smuggling networks, and money laundering networks. Also, the hashtag operation that was mentioned before that targeted recruiting and radicalization of Brazilian youngsters towards ISIL. Currently in Argentina, there are two ongoing investigations that are very important. The one aimed at Baracat clan in the provincia and in the province of La Misiones, which has been very also successful, and they have been able to include in the Argentinian terror watch list 14 Hezbollah facilitators, and that the reinvestigation of the AMIA case, who recently brought up some very interesting news and arrest warrants against perpetrators of the AMIA attacks. Also in Peru, as we know, the Hamdar case, and in Colombia, many of them on the nexus, like the Chakri Harb, Ayman Juman case that was investigated together with the United States, and also some cases in Central America. Well, but these are some of them. Of course, there are others that were not that much successful, because the nexus is something still to be more. The region has to know better the nexus to assess what is being happening in there. So I'll say that as a region, we are talking more about the nexus. We are discussing the nexus. We're going to have this report and other instances in which we can debate and exchange good practices, as our good friend from Gafilat has also introduced here and brilliantly exposed how we can address from so many different directions, converging to the same objective. So I'll say that in a line of time, as we improve our legislations, as we bound to UN and OAS's regulations and resolutions, we will be stronger to fight the Nexus. But the region has been fighting the Nexus, and in cases that we have faced, some of them have been actually quite successful. Thank you. But they are not enough, of course. We still have to go. We still have a long way to go in order to be able to actually thwart this kind of threats in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much for your question. Any other questions that you might have? Please, delegate from Ecuador.
Thank you very much, Lina, and of course, thank you to all the speakers for excellent presentations. I think I had several questions, but I think in the interest of time, I will limit myself to just one. And I think this is for Mr. Juan Cruz. I think your presentation was quite interesting. And you were talking about the effectiveness in implementation of FAT standards. And I think you mentioned that some common challenges were identified in the region. I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that point to see what kind of challenges the region is facing in that respect. And the second point I wanted to make is that I'm looking forward to reading the report that UNICRI is elaborating on this point. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you so much for your question. I think that it's a very interesting one. However, it's very wide. I think that if we would elaborate on that, we should spend a lot of minutes. However, regarding the immediate outcome one, which relates to in general terms, to the identification, assessment, and understanding of the risks, it was found in our region, as well as in many other regions across the world, that some of the more important challenges relates to the proper identification of the TF risks, because sometimes the level of understanding, not only of the relevant competent authorities, but also by the private sector's relevant stakeholders, still has room for improvement. Other cross-cutting challenges relates to the lack of adequate resources, because many of our countries face some constraints regarding resources, and this also has an impact in those areas where there are not high top priorities, and sometimes given that the risk on TF is not considered to be high, there are not many resources applied for that purpose. There are also some common challenges related to the level of specialization and also to the training in this matter. This has been seen in all of our assessment, and it's also very common around the globe. And this is precisely because of the challenge and the complexity of this threat, this crime, and the way it evolves. There are some other challenges related to the technical compliance, for example, the typification of some aspects of the TF offense, the crime, such as the foreign fighters issue, as well as the other figures which are covered by the standards. Regarding the investigation, still there is room for improvement on the financial investigations of the cases. This is also a challenge regarding money laundering investigations, but it's very clear as well in the TF field and in several others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan. I know there can be more questions. You have our contacts. We, in any case, stay in this ongoing dialogue. But it's time to close the event. I will give the floor to Ms. Alison Trappel, please.
Thank you, Lina. Again, thanks everyone for your patience, for sticking with us. I know I myself am running to the train station, so I just want to thank you all for coming and for participating. Again, thank you to our panelists for joining us today, for sharing extremely useful insights. I think we all have food for thought. And certainly I hope we are all more convinced that this, in fact, is not just a theory, but that there are linkages that we need to begin to pay closer attention to as countries, as governments, as organizations, really a whole of society approach, as was mentioned before. So I want to just thank everyone here at the head table. Again, our amazing partners at UNICRI under Director Antonio de Meo, and here represented by Leif and Oren. Thank you so much for your support in organizing this event. Of course, to the government of Chile, thank you very much in your role as current chair of CTED, of our committee, represented here by the Permanent Mission of Chile to the UN. Thank you very much for supporting this conversation. And of course, to the Undersecretary General and CTED Executive Director, Natalia Germain, who was here earlier, but again, represented here by Ahmed Sef Dawala, sorry. And Lina Cepeda, of course, thank you so much for working with the OAS and CTED and organizing this event. And again, a special shout out to those who connected online. Thank you for participating. Thank you also for the comments that you made. We did take note. And as Lina said, we hope to be able to continue this conversation, answer your questions, and stay engaged on this issue. As some of you may have heard me say in my remarks on Monday's session, CTED truly believes in the power of partnership, collaboration, cooperation among all sectors and all actors. And it's truly the only way to help our region be better prepared and more resilient to organized crime, to terrorism, to violent extremism. So again, with that, count on us to stay connected and committed to this goal, and we look forward to working with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Please now, Mr. Leif, Bill Latsen, you have the floor.
Willersen. Thanks a lot, and I understand you have to catch a train, so it will be very, very short, I promise. Your Excellencies, of course, I would like to thank all of you who have contributed to this extremely interesting and I think very relevant side event, whether you're here in the room or online. Special thanks, of course, to the co-organizer of the event, my colleagues from OAS, from CTED, from the Permanent Representative of Chile, to United Nations, and of course to all the experts who participated by presenting during this session, NYPD, Gafilat, the monitoring team, excellent presentation. Just one thing that I would like to highlight. As you know, I've said many times, we are going to publish this report on the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism during the next couple of weeks, hopefully next week or the week after. I think it's important to emphasize, my colleague Christian said it was an academic report. It is an academic report, but it's not only an academic report. I mean, for us, it's very, very important that when we are doing this kind of research from a UNICRI point of view, we're not really doing it only for the sake of the research. It's really, there's a reason why we call it action-oriented research. We really would like to translate the analysis, the findings, and all the recommendations in this research into programmatic actions, real actions on the ground in cooperation with our friends from OAS. So I really look forward to working with all of you on that. And as I mentioned in my introduction or in my opening remarks, I really rely on your support, cooperation, and partnership when we turn all that into actions on the ground. I thank you for your commitment to this topic and for your support, and hope to see you again soon. I thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Ahmed Saif El-Dawala, you have the floor.
Very happy that you managed to complete the name as well. So it's been complicated carrying that name, but I would like also on behalf of CTED and certainly SG German to thank everyone present here, especially until this hour, to thank the representative of Chile and Chile for supporting having this meeting, our partners, UNICRI, OAS, CTED. It's a great pleasure to be part of these exercises to exchange information. Of course, all the panelists and all the lessons learned we've observed from them. The report launched today helps us increase our understanding of the terrorism transnational organized crime nexus in the Americas and to identify possible responses, as also requested by multiple Security Council resolutions. So thank you for making our life easier in that process, to the extent possible, of course. But undoubtedly, the presentations delivered today remind us of a reality we all live in. Basically, that terrorist organizations and organized crime, they all have a privilege we all do not have. We have to be successful every day. They have to be successful only once. So together with our partnership, we'll make sure to deprive them from that privilege. And we very much look forward to our continued cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The event is closed.